If I were to tell you that Vladimir Putin's son, I know he doesn't have a son, but go with me here, married one of the Obama daughters, do you think people would be upset? Do you think they would be concerned about his influence on our politics? Well, in 1796, a high-ranking British official married George Washington's granddaughter while he was president. Today, we'll be talking about Thomas Law, his life, and his children with Dr. Rosemarie Zagarri. This is Too Complicated for History. Our guest today is Rosemarie Zagarri, a university professor and historian at George Mason who specializes in early American politics, women in politics, and the like. Thanks so much for being here, Rosie.
Oh, thrilled to be here.
I'm especially excited because Dr. Zagarri was my PhD advisor at George Mason University. So it's great to see you again, Rosie, and definitely a historical hero of mine. So really glad to have you here today.
And now I'm on the hot seat instead of you.
I know. But you don't have any degrees, at least pending this. It's just sharing your awesome knowledge.
Do people consider that like the lineage of who you learned from important when you're a historian? Like, if you're in school, like who was your advisor and their advisor and stuff? Do you keep track of all of those things?
Just that's inside baseball, but yes, my advisor was the eminent Yale historian Edmund S. Morgan, which makes Lynn a grandchild of Edmund S. Morgan. So
that's pretty cool.
That is pretty neat. Yeah, because I remember Lynn had mentioned that your advisor was Edmund Morgan. So it was I was curious if that holds any weight or if it's just sort of a cool like dinner table like conversation. But we're here to talk about a new area of study of yours, Rosie, a gentleman that I don't think many of our listeners probably have ever heard of, a man named Thomas Law. Could you tell us a little bit about who he was?
Okay, well, Thomas Law is known in a few historical circles, but I hope that my work will make him more widely known. And this is a great way to introduce him to the wider world. So Thomas Law was born in 1756 in Britain of a clerical family. His father was a philosopher at Cambridge and then an Anglican cleric and later became a bishop. So he was raised in this sort of upper class family. But he, like a lot of men of his day, was sort of knowledge rich but money poor, and so he went off to the East India Company in 1773 to British India, northern India, and made a small fortune, and then later on came to the United States in 1794. But what's interesting about him is, first of all, that he is this sojourner across empires. He was a resident and an intellectual, a philosopher of the British Empire, the Mughal Empire in India, and the early American Empire. And he was really steeped in these Enlightenment ideas about empire, about all human beings being equal, but also how to reform society to make societies better across the world and to apply sort of universal principles to make societies improve and advance on the scale from savagery to civilization, as they would put it. He's known in the United States primarily because he was one of the earliest developers of Washington, D.C. Washington, as a lot of you may know, did not exist as a city before it was founded as the national capital. And it was created by an act of Congress, and the U.S. government moved there in 1800. And he came with his fortune from British India and invested in this land. But as in India, where he was a sort of well-known reformer of the British East India Company, he became a reformer as well in the United States and tried to work against slavery, tried to devolve or encourage lawmakers to devolve property to Native Americans and to work for a variety of what we would call benevolent causes. That doesn't mean he was just a good guy, though. He always had his eye on doing well for himself, in other words, making a profit, as well as doing good. And in the process, there was a lot of wreckage along the way. Like his reforms in India were very controversial. What he attempted to do in the United States, he drew in a lot of people into his schemes for investing. And while he came out barely holding his hat and not going bankrupt, a number of his partners did not fare so well. So it's a story of sort of British Empire, comparative empire building in Britain and British India and the early American Republic, but it's also a family story because in India, Thomas Law, like many other individuals at that time who came over from Britain to India, took a native indigenous woman, a mistress, a concubine, or companion. The words are controversial, and had 3 what we'd call mixed race sons with this woman. And what's very interesting about Thomas Law is that when he left India, he brought his 3 young sons, who were all under 10 years of age, with him first to Britain and then to the United States. And so once he was in the United States, he actually built on his sort of reputation and ambition and married into George Washington's family. So I like to say that this was George Washington's mixed race relatives. And so one part of the story then is about how his mixed race children fared in the United States, how he negotiated life for them in the United States, and what it meant actually to be a Brit coming to the United States with a lot of assumptions about hierarchy and wealth and privilege and whiteness that in some ways were similar to what existed in the United States, but in some ways were different.
Wow. So he's a fascinating, very wide-ranging life.
Yes. So, that's why it's taken me so long to write the book. So.
I can only imagine. Let's dive into into the details of some of the stuff a little bit, if you don't mind. So before we get into sort of like the chronologically working through what he did in India versus before he came to the United States, something that stuck out to me when you were explaining like who he is in big picture. Not many people equate empire building with equality, like colonialism and the belief in universal rights. Is there seems to be a tension in my mind about that. So did he have a way of marrying these two things, just philosophically?
Yeah, that's a great question. He was steeped in these Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith and David Hume and Adam Ferguson and Douglas Stewart and a bunch of other people that believed in the universality of humanity. That is, that human beings were equal in whatever society they lived in. That is, equal in the sense of having the mental capacity to achieve, having the moral capacity to achieve. And so the goal of his kind of imperialism was to bring societies to that level. So it's that kind of equality rather than political equality that he was striving for. And he believed that, by applying these universal laws of human nature, by applying these principles of Adam Smith's political economy, you could put a society on the path from, as I said before, savagery to civilization, which
Gotcha.
is how he thought about what he was doing in British India with regard to the native peoples there.
Right. So it's a little different than sort of like, I guess, like relative egalitarianism, where you're looking at civilizations and cultures as equal, as opposed to like, hey, you have these people are able, they could be like England if they given the opportunity.
Exactly. And what's intriguing but also frustrating about this view is that in some ways it is, it's hard to use these terms, but it was somewhat more open-minded, I suppose you could say, than what succeeded it, say, in British India and even in the United States, with scientific racism and with a belief that some races are inherently inferior, some peoples are inherently inferior to others. So this belief in a universal human nature is that basic level of equality that he believed in the 18th century that was superseded in the 19th century by a much more hierarchical view of peoples and societies grounded in what we would call the pseudoscience of these racial beliefs.
Yeah, it doesn't sound progressive to us,
Right.
but at the time it was a step in a more equal direction. It's interesting.
Right.
I'm curious, when you say human nature, did this also include women? Were they specifying men? Did they believe that women were equal in mental capacity as the men? How was that?
Well, it did vary. And actually, a lot of these 18th century Enlightenment figures, including Thomas Law, did believe that women had the potential to have mental equality, intellectual equality with men if they were given the right education. Now, is that the same as advocating an equality of roles and positions? No, but it was, again, different from what happened in the 19th century by the Victorian era, which sort of assumed that women were intellectually inferior to men,
Right.
just the way, the native peoples of India came to be regarded as inherently inferior to the white peoples of Britain and America, or the African Americans or Indians came to be regarded in the 19th century as inherently inferior. So there's this moment in the 18th century, which I find fascinating, where there is this belief in the universal potential of all people, including women, with caveats.
Of course.
But there isn't a straight line of progress to greater equality. That is, there's a reshuffling of the hierarchies, and by grounding assumptions about human beings in science, pseudoscience, as we'd say, that physical differences like skin color or gender, make you more or less equal, then the 19th century actually, in a certain sense, regressed. And so, I mean, again, I don't want to defend Thomas Law and these enlightened figures too much, but I do think it's a cautionary tale that progress doesn't always go in a straight line, and that there can be regression as well as progression. And there was this moment of hope and belief in equality that was eclipsed then.
Yeah, not to get too deep into the philosophical side of all this, but that's I've talked with Lynn before about this, and that's the inherent danger in ideas like Descartesian dualism, where it's like, hey, this person that cries like you, that walks like you, that talks like you, isn't like you because there's something inherently different that you cannot see and you cannot. And like the pseudoscience, at least always felt to me as a search for physical proof of that inherent difference that they were projecting on people.
Absolutely.
They had an outcome that they wanted, and were trying to find reasons why it was true.
Yeah. And Thomas Law, unlike a lot of other 19th century Brits, I mean, really did not believe that Western religions were superior to, the religions of British India or of native India.
Wow.
And so he moved pretty far away from his father's Anglicanism, let's say. So I guess what attracts me about him is he's an intellectual, not just a sort of brute-fisted imperialist. But I think that's another reason why we have to be very careful when we think about him, because it's easy for me to get seduced by his ideas, but his actions also did have a lot of negative consequences. So we have to always, play off the good that he was trying to do with the bad consequences that sometimes ensued.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess if you hold him, at least his mind, in high esteem, it actually invites more criticism, because for those results, it's like you should have known better. But let's. I would love to know a little bit about some of those reforms, or what he did in the East India Company when he was in.
And if I can interject, can you explain what exactly the East India Company did, and who was a part of it, just what it is?
Oh, the East India Company, the British East India Company, was the biggest corporation in existence in the Western world at that time. Wow. It was originally chartered in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth, and it had a monopoly on all the trade with India and China and all the islands in between in Asia. And so it was an enormously large, powerful, and sometimes very rich company. A lot of members of parliament owned stock in the company, so they had a vested interest in the company. But a lot of the taxes or customs duties that were collected on East India Company goods as they traversed the globe were fed into the coffers of the British Empire and helped make the British Empire rich. And, they dealt in things that were staples in Britain and in America. Tea and textiles. Tea was from China, of course. Textiles were made, in volume in India before the Industrial Revolution. But spices, a lot of things that were just, started out as luxury goods, but became essential goods for the people in Anglo-America. And whenever the British East India Company was on the verge of failing, Parliament bailed it out because it was said it was too big to fail. So
history just keeps repeating itself, doesn't it? It's so modern.
It absolutely does. But I think that's an important background to understanding Thomas Law's significance, because he was joining up with this behemoth company that had its own private army, by the way, and had conquered large swaths of territory in northern India, including the most lucrative parts, Bengal, as it was called, which includes what we know as, what was known as Calcutta today. And, what the British wanted to do was monetize their conquests. So basically what they did was take over from the native rulers, the Mughals, who had been a couple of centuries before invaders themselves, but who had a very elaborate system of taxation by which they extracted wealth from the peoples who lived in India. And the British, were not being very successful. Their big victories in India, in northern India at least, other parts of India came later, but in northern India came actually as Britain was fighting the French and Indian War on the North American continent. So their big victory at what was called Plassey occurred in 1757. They got the French out, who had been aiding the native, Divans, as they were called, or Mughals, and they took over the tax collecting privileges in northern India. But the problem was, there were millions of people in northern India, and there were a couple of hundred British East India Company employees. So how do you collect taxes efficiently and profitably from these people? And several different taxation regimes were tried without much success or with limited success. And this was a big problem. And I should note coincidentally that this at the very same moment, the 1760s and 70s, that the taxation issue is coming to the fore in British North America.
Mm-hmm.
So a fact that people often overlook is that at the very same time that London was trying to deal with the taxation issue in the North American British colonies, the British East India Company and their overseers, the British government, were trying to resolve the taxation question in British India. And I find that correspondence that the connection there amazing. It's a connection we don't often draw. And I think that thinking about it from the imperial point of view, not just from the point of view of what's happening in America, gives you a broader scope or broader sense of what's going on.
Huh.
So that's a long introduction to what did Thomas Law do there? Well, he was part of this series of reformers, and he wasn't by any means the only one, but who was proposing a new system of taxation. And his proposal, and again, this wasn't just his alone, but to fix the tax, that is to fix a certain rate for the tax and to make it permanent. But where Thomas Law was different was he became a district administrator. He oversaw a district called Bihar in the north central part of the Indian subcontinent. And he actually attempted to implement on a small scale this new system of taxation. But what he insisted, and again, he wasn't alone in this, but what he insisted was that land had to be devolved to a certain class of individuals as private property in order for the taxes to be adequately collected. And so his plan got a lot of attention, and eventually it was adopted, and in 1793 came to be known as, and Cornwallis was his supervisor, and he was the one most associated with it who promoted it, and it became known as the permanent settlement. What's fascinating here too is another connection. I mentioned the name Lord Cornwallis. That might ring some bells with some of the listeners because they might know that Cornwallis was a very important British general during the American Revolution. And he was actually an infamous general on the British side because he was defeated ignominiously at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. And that was the last major battle of the American Revolution. Now, you might think after such a big loss, he would have just, retreated to England with his tail between his legs and never be heard of again. But Cornwallis was very savvy and very well politically connected. And somehow he was forgiven for all that. And he wound up in India, where he actually became known as a very great reformer and reformer of the British East India Company. He wanted to root out corruption in the East India Company. He conquered a lot of territory in India, so he was more successful militarily there than in the United States. He signed off on this proposal. And again, I want to emphasize, it wasn't just Thomas Law's proposal. There was a guy named John Shore who was extremely instrumental in promoting it, but Thomas Law was the one who sort of tried it out and promoted it, and it became known as the permanent settlement. So it established a permanent rate of taxation in perpetuity, at least theoretically, in northern India, and devolved private property to a whole class of individuals. It basically, what had been customary land ownership became sort of de facto land ownership due to this British decree. So it's rather, in terms of imperial majesty, that is a pretty impressive one, and something that of course, absolutely did not have to be done in the United States. Well, what became the United States in British North America, because, the whole basis of the colonies in North America was the division of private property. So very different imperial settings, but this whole focus on taxation, on imperial governance, on centralization was common in the 1760s and 70s, and this very interesting connection between Cornwallis in both places. And if I just might add here, I was giving a talk about this at Ohio State University, and a woman who had been born in India came up to me afterward, and she said, I had no idea Cornwallis had a career in North America before he came to Britain. And just as I said, well, I had no idea Cornwallis had a career in British India after the United States.
That's very funny.
So Thomas Law kind of bridges these gaps or bridges these continents and shows us how interconnected this 18th century world was under the auspices of the British Empire.
Now, when you say that he wanted to devolve private property, or basically formalize ownership under basically native Indians there, was it those would still be like landowning classes of people there, but it just was not British? Is that am I understanding that correctly, or is it? It's not like a we're just going to divvy it amongst the people. Like the village now belongs to everybody, and everyone gets like a little lot. Right? Is it sort of like I'm just curious as to actually the function of it. I understand how it would in theory relate to taxes.
Yeah. Oh, this is so complicated, and
we don't have to necessarily get into it if it's too much.
Let me put it most simply: land ownership in this native society was customary, and it wasn't by a sort of written deed, and there were customary groupings of people. We might call them classes. Some, worked the land and were mostly what we would call peasants. Others were primarily tax collectors, but there were many layers in between. And what is breathtaking about what Cornwallis and Thomas Law did here is that they just pulled out that class of traditional tax collectors and say, you actually own the land in the sense of, a Western conception of private property.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty reasonable. I guess the takeaway there is that the sort of the caste and social structures of India are very complicated.
Very complicated. But again, I think the idea of taxing to produce revenue is a common thread here across the empire.
Absolutely. If it's okay, I'd kind of like to jump into some of the personal things that you talked about Thomas Law. I'm really interested in his concubine, mistress. I'm not sure what term to use. His partner. How about that?
Partner, companion.
His lady friend.
His lady friend. And I think the thing that's most interesting to me is we don't even know her name. Is that correct? Yeah. And she's sort of just lost to history. And that this wasn't an isolated incident, that a lot of the European men who were going to India, there weren't European women. So they ended up coupling with, native women. And, how did this work? These women just kind of disappeared when they left?
Yeah. Okay. So the native term is Bibi, or it's Bibi. That's so companion is probably our partner is the most neutral term. But yes, so what's fascinating is that there were the number of European women in India at this time was minuscule. I mean, I've read ratios of one white woman to 12 white men,
Wow.
So it was customary, again, although not officially sanctioned, that these officials would take a companion. Sometimes it was their housekeeper. Sometimes it was someone they met in another way. They would form a marriage-like relationship with them. And again, we know that French fur traders did this, for example. British did it too, but it's less common in North America. But the French definitely did this in North America and formed households and had children. And what's interesting about these British East India Company employees and also the soldiers who were there who did this is that they did have these children, and the question is what to do about the children. And well, let me say what Thomas Law didn't do, which is just abandon his children, as many of the other men did at this time. When their time in India was up, they left, and they left their companion and their children, and probably had no more contact with them. We do know that there were smaller numbers, mostly in the higher ranks of the officer corps or of the British East India Company, who did try to provide for their native families. So sometimes they left pensions for their families or the women when they left. A smaller number might send their sons or daughters to England to be educated during the 1780s. And then, especially for the men, the young men, the mixed race children, they would come back and they would be employed by the British East India Company, and they would actually be quite effective as sort of intermediaries between the native population and the British East India Company. But what is very interesting is that right at the time Thomas Law was there, and because Cornwallis came in 1786, Cornwallis actually started tightening and restricting the possibilities of these mixed race children to serve in the British East India Company and to serve in the official British East India Company Army. There could be separate ranks of native troops, but they couldn't serve the British East India Company Army. And similarly, they could be unofficially related to the East India Company, but they could no longer be hired by the East India Company. So at the same time that Thomas Law had these children, they were young children. And then in 1791, Thomas Law actually got very sick, and his children were, as I say, under 10 years old. He was told to leave India for his health, and he actually brought his children with him back to Britain and then ultimately to the United States. Now, this wasn't unheard of, and part of what British historians are telling us now is that, there were many more people of color in Britain in the 18th century than we've ever realized, and you would especially notice them in a place like London. And there was even a sort of abandoned child problem, both in Calcutta and in London at this time. But there were smaller numbers of these mixed race children who actually married into British society. This was true especially of light-skinned mixed race young women. And then the boys had a harder time once the ranks of the East India Company in Calcutta closed up to them. And so I think what Thomas Law was responding to is the fact that the children had no future as he saw it in India. Now, if you noticed, I haven't talked much about the mother, the wife. And we do know that Thomas Law did leave a pension for her. But in all the letters I've read of his, and I have read thousands, I can assure you, he only refers to her by a few times and never by name. He refers to her as a woman or the mother of my children. And this is part of what we think about, or what historians talk about when they talk about the erasure of Native women in the imperial setting. And another of the things that Thomas Law did, and some other of these especially high-ranking East India Company officials did was baptize their children. And so they were baptized, and their names are recorded at St. John's Church in Calcutta. And that's a way for Thomas Law to claim patriarchy, to claim his patriarchal claim on them. And when he took them with him, obviously, I mean, he took them away from their mother forever with not much thought of that. But I suppose the thought was he could give them a better life or something. But, it must have been wrenching. It must have been terrible. And, it was a very hard life from what we know for the women who were left behind. So, that's all we know about her. But we do have these sort of shards of information that give us tantalizing clues.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
So when I first heard about this whole scenario and Thomas Law from you, sort of in passing and tangential to another conversation we were having, I got pretty excited. Mostly because I'm half Indian.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting for me to be able to sort of project sort of like my ethnic history all the way back to like the because otherwise it's not, you don't hear about those folks around. So for me to be like, oh, there's a couple of half white, half Indian kids running around in, early DC involved in their fathers involved in all of this stuff was actually like a really intriguing thing for me to learn about. Why there's some sort of emotional attachment to that, I'm not 100% certain. That's something I need to sort of like tease out within myself. But it was intriguing nonetheless. But I was curious if, well, actually, the baptism thing also made me really actually kind of funny because my father's mother, we believe, baptized me and my sister in secret. Just because Irish Catholic, wanted to make sure she was covering all the bases. But anyway, not to air too much family history.
But this is also a very interesting thing about the baptism because, and Thomas Law taking the children, because it's such a contrast with American slavery where, we know there was widespread sexual relationships between white males and the female slaves on these plantations, even if it was officially forbidden. But they almost never recorded the children as being, the children of the white master. We do have, most notably with, Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, glimpses of masters freeing their children, but that was the exception rather than the rule.
Right.
And not until the 19th century did large numbers of African Americans even start to get baptized. So it's a very different situation. And I think it just reflects the difference in the patriarchal norms, the importance of the male line in the British tradition there.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's almost like what you said, a lot of those lighter skinned women that came mixed women that were growing up in England were able to marry into certain families and stuff. And that goes to show you like a lot of like at least the societal divisions were based a lot on, physical differences between them. Because if you're talking about just sort of like typical, I forget what the actual words are, phenotypical sort of representations of the way, facial structure and stuff like that. Indians tend to be pretty closer to English peoples. They would look more similar.
Yes.
The kids of mixed race kids would look more similar to that. So like by the time you get like two generations out, you might not be able to tell the difference.
Right.
Like just to the, naked eye. So how did those kids?
But acculturation was also very important. I mean, that idea of, when the mixed race kids were sent to England, they were, acculturated, assimilated into middle or upper class English society. They got an education. And so they acted, quote unquote, white British. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's funny. You can actually still hear in Indian accents today the British influence on upper, like, you can tell sort of like where someone is a little bit in India by listening to their accent and how close it sounds to a British accent. That's versus further away. Anyway, it still trickles down today.
Yeah. No, it does.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, I think.
You had mentioned early on about Thomas Law and this idea of equality, and that he was, if not an outright abolitionist, he did not support slavery, and he comes to the American colonies with his 3 mixed race children, and he marries a very large slave owner in Eliza Custis, who is also the step granddaughter of George Washington. So how in the world did the two of them end up together and deal with these children? I mean, was she a good mother, or, how did she feel about this?
Okay, so Eliza Custis adored the boys, and she told them from the beginning that she wanted to be called mother, that she considered herself their mother.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in her mind, she made this radical distinction between these mixed race kids born of a British aristocrat and her enslaved people. And she had anywhere from eventually 60 to 100 that she inherited through her father's estate. So I think that I think it's part of this the games that people are able to play with race and classification, and how much it is based on the associations with class. But she wanted to be their mother, and she considered herself their mother until the marriage went south and they separated and eventually got divorced. But it was very heart-wrenching for her, actually. I think she was genuinely attached to the boys.
Did they have any children together themselves?
Eliza Custis and Thomas Law, who married in 1796, about 2 years after Thomas Law came to the United States, had one daughter, also named Eliza, confusingly. And yes, she was doted on and pampered and privileged. And so they had the one daughter.
Was there any worry about this British aristocrat marrying into the president's family? Like, was that because there was also an age difference between the two of them? Like, I imagine, like, internally, like, the family, it might not have been the smoothest sort of like, hey, by the way, look, meet my boyfriend. We're engaged.
Eliza was pretty young, right? Wasn't she?
Yeah. Okay. So there was about a 20-year age difference. Eliza was about 20 and he was 39. Thomas Law was 39 when they married. She was a very difficult person, Eliza was. She, her father died when she was very young. Actually, he died. The father of Eliza Custis died because he insisted on going to Yorktown during the battle, even though he wasn't a soldier, and he got camp fever and he died. So Eliza was very young and spent a lot of time with George and Martha Washington as she was growing up. She she sort of demanded, like she was bored to tears on her stepfather's plantation in Maryland. And she demanded that she be allowed to go to Philadelphia during Washington's presidency. And that's where she met Thomas Law, probably at one of Martha Washington's weekly salons or something like that. And I think she was just captivated by him. Eliza was very intelligent, well educated, but moody and difficult. And I think she just saw this, just well-traveled, well-educated man who was very interested in her for whatever reasons. And they married maybe less than a year after they met. The family was not thrilled, but Martha actually probably was thrilled. The grandma was thrilled, Martha Washington. I think that her stepfather was worried about the children, the mixed race children, and becoming a mother immediately. I think some observers were worried about Thomas Law's loyalties, actually.
Yeah,
You
right. There's a
Right.
political question there.
And there are these occasional letters reassuring Washington. He is a good Republican, the Republican in the small r sense, like committed to the United States. And, I think that there was concern that, would he take her back to England and leave? So, and was he a fortune hunter? I mean, I think that's the bottom line. Was he a fortune hunter? So all these things were good questions, but I think he saw a strategic advantage in marrying Eliza. But he always comments on how pretty she was, and I think he was taken with her beauty and initially her intelligence. But she did prove to be extremely difficult in the marriage. And ultimately, that led to their separation in 1804. But I still didn't get to the point about slavery. And so Thomas Law was opposed to slavery, and did not believe in the institution. However, at various points, he did own slaves. Now, he
did
owned
he purchase them, or was how did he acquire them?
Purchased some of them from Eliza, actually, for minimal amounts of money, and actually freed a number of them.
Oh, okay.
Members of the Costin family. He purchased others that he kept as what has been called term slaves. That is, they were kept for a certain number of years with the promise of freedom. But none, so you could say it was kind of indentured servitude. That's how he rationalized it to himself. But, I wouldn't, to call him an abolitionist, you have to put like a big asterisk next to the term.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's hard to say when you're acquiring people.
Yes.
You're doing both those things.
He did have actually a plan that he tried to get Eliza, his wife, to support, where he could use some of the land from the family to transition some slaves to freedom, but it never got off the ground. But it was a plan that he had, along with later plans that he actually tried to propose to in the 18 teens and 20s to the leaders of Washington, D.C., the political leaders, including John C. Calhoun. He was good friends with Henry Clay. He was good friends with Thomas Jefferson. He peddled this plan for gradual abolition that resembles in some ways what the British actually wound up doing in the Caribbean and Jamaica, sort of compensated manumission. But as you can imagine, this Brit trying to peddle this plan for compensated manumission did not get very far in the United States. So he was well-intentioned, I suppose, and did have this principled opposition to slavery, but as I say, with an asterisk.
What happened to his sons? So, we're talking about what he's doing. Were the sons educated? Were they successful? The mixed race sons?
Yes.
How did they do in the U.S.?
So one of the sons, the middle son, actually died within 2 years of coming to the United States as a young boy. So that was very sad. But one of them, the eldest, John Law, attended Harvard College and then read law, as they call it, in Baltimore and became an attorney. And he was actually a very successful attorney in Washington, D.C. in the early first decades of the 19th century. And one of the things, and he did what normal lawyers do, a lot of land transactions and wills and deeds. And he took care of a lot of his father's business, though, too. And Thomas Law was always involved in a lot of lawsuits. And so that was a big part of his job. But he was sort of well-known and well-respected in the Washington community. He actually married a white woman and had 2 children with her. But one of the most remarkable things that I don't think is an accident is that he was very active in the 18 teens in suing for freedom for Black people, enslaved people who either claimed to have a white mother or who claimed that their master had deeded them to freedom and were trying to prove it. And so he was the attorney of record on a lot of these lawsuits, which I find very remarkable. And in some sense, maybe I'm overreading it, but in some sense, a sort of, alliance of these people of color, even though I don't think he necessarily identified like that, but I think, he identified with the desire to remove them from, their shackles of oppression.
Yeah, not to project too much, but whether or not, no matter how he identified, you never really lose the sense of other in that situation. So there's at least
that's a good way to put it. Yes,
yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
Like
yes.
even though you're not, in the most oppressed group of folks, you still are not a full member of the other one.
Yes, yes. So I think that now, unfortunately, he died when he was under 40 in 1822. And so we don't really know. He was actually also very active in Washington, D.C. politics, served on the council.
What was his name? We have mentioned it.
John Law.
John Law.
I mean, it's, not memorable names, unfortunately. So,
and he was a lawyer. I mean,
yes,
it fits.
Right. Believe me, when you're doing Google searches like that, you get a lot of stuff you don't want. The other son, Edmund Law, actually stayed in Britain because he was very young. He was probably 6 or 7 when he came to Britain. And Thomas Law kept him, or his sister, who was wealthy, Lady Rumbold, took him in and reared him for almost 10 years in Britain. So he didn't come back. He didn't come to the United States until he was almost 17 years old, and really had a sort of upper class education in England. And then, but once he was here, unfortunately, it was in the middle of Thomas and Eliza separating, but Thomas sent him off to Yale. And so he graduated from Yale, and he had an even harder time, I think, adapting, losing that sense of what you call otherness, than his older brother did, since he came when he was older. And he had a hard time figuring out what he wanted to do. He said, "Oh, I want to be a lawyer like my older brother." And Thomas said, "No, one lawyer in the family is enough." And then, he did a lot of Thomas Law's commercial business, property business. He attempted to, found businesses in DC, but none of them was very successful. His greatest success, though, was, and he was very conscious that he didn't want to be a burden on his father, though. It's a very poignant, kind of sad relationship, I think. But he finally found some success in the 1820s. He went down to Florida and was actually a commissioner once the United States obtained Florida, and was sort of a commissioner of the claims and sort of processing, a territorial administrator down there. But then after John Law died in 1822, his father needed him and more or less demanded that he come back to Washington, which Edmund Law, the youngest one, did. And he dealt with that for a time. And then his father went to England in 1825. And when Thomas Law came back, Thomas Law came back after his 1825 visit to England. He found that Edmund Law, his son, had a child out of wedlock with a young woman in Washington, D.C. And he was not happy about this. And Edmund wanted to marry the woman, and that would have been the right thing to do. But Thomas Law said, "You have no profession. You have no means of support. You cannot marry her." And again, that's this.
Sounds like my mom.
This strong parental figure, decreeing what his child could do. And he found something for Edmund to do, and he sent him off on a voyage to Mexico with a commander porter, and was a sort of aide assistant to this commander, a commercial assistant on this voyage to Mexico. And then he eventually came back in 1827 or so, very sort of, I don't know, alienated from his father, but they patched things up. But then he seems to have gotten sick, and he also died sort of prematurely as a younger man, young middle-aged man. So he died in 1829. And so both predeceased Thomas Law, who died in 1834. So the promise of these mixed-race children had been partially achieved. And that Thomas Law always said one of the reasons he came to the United States was because he thought his natural children, that's what they called illegitimate children at that time, natural children, would have a better chance at life. And they did get excellent educations. And it seems that socially there were not, high barriers to their participation in Washington society, partly because of their, education and British background and their father's high social status. But, their premature deaths just cut off, the ending of the story.
The legacy there.
Yeah, we don't really know. And even Eliza, his daughter with Eliza Custis, she died at a very young age.
Jeez.
She had 4 children, but she died at age 24.
18th and 19th century people keep doing that.
Yeah.
They just can't seem to stay alive.
So I'm curious, did Edmund ever get married? Because obviously he wanted to marry this other woman, was forbidden, and who knows what happened to that poor woman and her child.
Well, we actually know something about it.
We do?
Yes.
Okay. What happened to
it?
it?
No, they were not allowed to marry.
Mm-hmm.
And,
I find that kind of hilarious because it's like, it's like, how could you have a child out of wedlock? He's like, where did you learn this? From you, Dad.
I know. I learned it from watching you.
Yeah, come on. Come on now.
Absolutely. Do as I say, not as I do. But what's fascinating is that when Thomas Law died in 1834, he had a very explicit will. Okay, and so just to give you a little bit more background on him, he bought up some of the prime properties in Washington, D.C. in 1794, before the government had come there. And he was one of the prime movers in trying to make Washington into a sort of thriving capital city. And on the original L'Enfant plan for the city, there was a canal that was supposed to go from the Potomac River up to the Capitol along what is now Constitution Avenue in D.C., and then cut down Capitol Hill to what we know as the Anacostia River, but was called the Eastern Branch there. And the purpose of this canal was to bring goods to the city and to, make it easier to load and unload, to provide, a more thriving commerce, to make it just easier to get from place to place. But the government wouldn't fund this. And Thomas Law and a small group of other early Washington, D.C. businessmen, property owners, were actually totally instrumental in getting the funds to build this canal. And so, I tell my family this every time we go down Constitution Avenue, but there's a lock house at Constitution Avenue and 17th Street, right, kitty corner from the White House grounds, like within sight of the Washington Monument. And there was a canal there, and that was the lock house where the lock was. And yes, it was all filled in. It became a big sewer and was filled in the late 19th century. But for a time, there was a canal there. So Thomas Law was very instrumental in that, in promoting businesses. He envisioned Washington, D.C. as the center of trade, as did Washington himself. George Washington saw Washington, D.C. as both, a place where goods from abroad would be brought in, and then it would be an entrepot for goods from the interior to be brought and shipped abroad. So, that this canal, the C&O Canal, was a separate canal that actually joined with the Washington Canal at that lock house.
Oh.
That's so cool.
So he was a big promoter of Washington, D.C., and he never really was able to see his dreams realized to their fullest. His land was mostly on Capitol Hill and down to the Anacostia River, especially along New Jersey Avenue. And to his chagrin, the development that occurred in the early 19th century actually went westward toward the president's house, toward the White House and Georgetown, more than from the Capitol down to the Anacostia. So he was left holding the bag with a lot of property that was for a long time not very valuable. And so he was always on the edge of bankruptcy. But what I like to emphasize is that many early developers in Washington, D.C. went bankrupt.
Yeah.
And by hook or crook and a lot of lawsuits, he did not go bankrupt. He kept his head above water even after the divorce from Eliza Custis. He actually won a huge lawsuit in 1815 that helped keep him afloat. And, things were stabilizing after the canal opened. The canal also opened in 1815. The big victory was after the War of 1812, when Washington, D.C. was burned. He and this other group of businessmen kept the capital at Washington, and had been strong pressure to move it away. But in a way, Washington came back stronger than ever after the War of 1812. And so for a time, it seemed like, Thomas Law's dreams of this great national capital were going to be realized, which is just a long way of going back to, I was talking about Edmund Law and Thomas Law's will. So by the time that Thomas Law died, his daughter with Eliza had died. His sons, his mixed race sons, had died. So all he had left were grandchildren. So his grandchildren from Eliza, who were living in Baltimore. And since his sons were dead, he had 3 grandsons, the 2 from the eldest son, John Law, and this one illegitimate child from Edmund. He left the sons, the grandchildren of the mixed race relationship, a certain amount of money. Okay. But Eliza's children had received a lot of property due to his marriage settlement and, the divorce settlement with her. So they had received a lot of property. So he didn't leave them anything else. And he said, if they contest, that is, challenge this will, I'm going to cut off even more from them. Well, they were greedy and they did contest the will, but it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's why we know that Edmund Law's illegitimate son did actually get, finally, after 20 years after Thomas Law died, his bequest from his grandfather.
Oh, wow.
So it was a incredible court case. And in the course of reading the court case, you see by this time Washington property was appreciating, and these heirs of Eliza Custis and of little Eliza, their mother, were extremely wealthy, because the property that Thomas Law had bought was now appreciating in value. And one thing I also like to, like in imagining this time, there was a hotel on New Jersey Avenue and C Street right down from the Capitol, where there's now a house office building, and it was called the Varnum Hotel, and it was just the place to stay in Washington, D.C. And one of Eliza Custis's grandchildren got that. And so
wow.
It was originally one of Thomas Law's houses, but it was a fabulous place. So his legacy lived on for a while, and even though his natural children did not, but his grandchildren did survive, and some of them thrived. I will say that the children through Eliza became Confederates in the Civil War, whereas the illegitimate child by Edmund became a soldier in the Union Army.
Well, there you go.
I don't know what that means.
Brother against brother, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if read into that what you will, audience. But that's a remarkable life. I mean, I know we've
really
sort of skimmed over the top of the surface, and I'm incredibly excited to see your work, your book.
It's amazing that this guy just sort of floated beneath the surface. There is a park now, a park down by the National Stadium that was built where part of the canal ran, and there is a signage there that talks about Thomas Law. But other than that, his contribution to DC has been kind of forgotten. But again, I would say what's important about his story is not just what he did for DC, but sort of the larger symbolism of the connections between Britain and the United States, and the ideas about race and the ideas about empire, and the connections that existed that are right below the surface that we haven't even begun to scratch. And so that's really what I'm trying to do with this project.
Well, and hopefully when it comes out, more interest will be, accrued on Thomas Law, and maybe his story will be more understood by the general public.
Well,
that's certainly always our goal, isn't it?
Yes. Well, once I finish it, I'm going to actually begin a campaign to have a street named after Thomas Law. So.
Oh, sweet.
Send us the petition. I'll sign it.
I'll sign it. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Rosie, so much for being with us. I think, you're a tour de force, and every contribution you make to, the academic history is a remarkable one. I can't wait to hear about this or read this book for, both personal reasons, but just even just being a history nerd.
Yeah.
Pretty excited about it.
History nerds unite.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to me, and good luck with all this.
Thank you. And is there any, do you want to talk about any of your previous books or anything that you'd like the audience to know about?
They can Google me if they want.
You heard that, audience. Google Rosemarie Zagarri.
We'll post some links on our Twitter like that to give you guys a starting point. But thanks so much, Rosie.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the full episode of Too Complicated for History. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please leave us a review on Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms at 2C4H_podcast, or check out the link in the description. This will keep you in the loop for show updates, new episodes, and exclusive content. Join us for our next episode with our guest, Dr. Cassandra Good. She'll be talking about friendships in the founding era.
Too Complicated for History is a podcast from Primary Source Media. Produced by Patrick Long and Lynn Price Robbins. Edited and mixed by Curtis Fritsch. Opening theme music by Sheena Biratella.